Okay, here's the question. If the panelists could speak to directed energy tools currently in use, for example, military weapons, do any relate to any aspect of Russell's science?
Well, that's...
I personally am not familiar with any
I've
military directed energy tools, so
The only one I know of or can speak to is they have ways of directing basically a microwave magnetron, which is the gizmo in the microwave that actually makes the microwave radiation. They can basically make that into a gun or a sort of a horn, and they can direct it at people. They tell you it's only going to give you like a surface sunburn, but of course, if you increase the intensity or the proximity to the radiation, it's going to go right through you. It's going to unzip your DNA. It's going to damage tissue. So you can use radiation as a directed, energy weapon. But much beyond that, for crowd control, I don't know what it's used for or what, it's pretty nefarious, so I haven't really looked much into that. And other than that, there's a lot of speculation, so it's not really, I can't tell you concrete that it came from Russell's concept. But of course, any science that we develop can be used, like the nuclear bomb, right? Nuclear energy powers a lot of our cities, but you can also fashion it into a warhead and kill millions of people all at once. So the science is a power, and it's how we as humanity and civilization use that power for good or for bad.
Can you please speak to that a little bit, Margaret, about how that was what was so important? Part of what Leo was so passionate about is that the science had to be balanced with a loving philosophy.
Yeah, I think that's why after Walter Russell refolded, there wasn't a lot of emphasis in actually building the technology, because she did feel that if it got into the wrong hands, maybe it wouldn't do good. But at the same time, they really wanted to replace atomic fission. Atomic fission is heat to the nth degree. So it's severely hot, and that's why it'll vaporize things in an instant. A tree you can burn in a few hours, but if you radiate it with atomic fission, it's gone in seconds. So it's like the decay principle carried to the nth degree. And that's what, of course, gave them the impetus to write their book, Atomic Suicide. So Leo Russell always said that the key to their science is the person that has the right motivation for the science will discover it and develop it and implement it. But it's, anything that's powerful like this can be used for war or industry, but also for good. Yeah.
Next question from our audience.
Thank you, Kimberly. So, again, this is a little off in left field, but I've had a long interest in water, and I found what Margaret shared about water interesting. YouTube recently has put up a Gaia program called Secrets of Water, and in that program it suggests that water holds memory. And so I'm kind of back to this notion of where's the interface between our invisible self, our real self, and our body, our moving self. So it's a little bit related to, well, what is the pineal and what is it doing and how is that the bridge or the inert gases? And my question would be, as we all know, we're a bag of water. Every cell is 75 to 95% water. Japanese researcher Emoto has demonstrated that water can hold emotions, so I don't have any question that thought can be contained, if you will, in water. And so then I get to this question, which is to what extent, if at all, does water function as some sort of a bridge between our self, our real self, our invisible self, and our physical self? And that's kind of an off-the-wall question, but anybody has any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, when in Walter's philosophy, when he talks about the mind, how the mind, creates the physical world that we see, I mean, that's real. And when I first heard about that, when I first, encountered his philosophy, it was hard to kind of take in, and but the more that I've studied it, it becomes more and more clear as you open your mind to that thing, that that other world, if you want, that's like outside of the physical world. It's really, we are connected to that, and just our own intention can manifest things, that example of the water holding memory, and then feeding that water to plants, and it's kind of like, when you go and you interact with that water and those plants, and you have the good intention in your mind, or of growth or whatever, then you see it affects the plants and they grow more, versus if you're having bad thoughts or something. But so it's like that connection from the unphysical to the physical, I think, is very real. And so we just have to practice that. We have to practice, and we can hone those skills. So I don't know if you guys think.
The only thing I would add is that to me, water's a liquid crystal, and as such, it can transduce. It's a way of transducing an invisible thought form into a physical action or result. And so it's probably no mistake. It's very much by design that that all life as we understand it is either in water or contains water, because it's that living crystal that allows us to manifest as, or experience as, a physical being, when we are in fact a spiritual divine being, right? That's our natural state, if you will. And we have to somehow put on a garment to have a physical experience in a physical world, and water's probably that first step into crystallizing, a thought form into a physical action. So that's all I can really say about that.
Yeah, and I would add, if you look at people and health, when people are dehydrated, there's not going to be a lot of electrical energy transmitted. In other words, they're running down in energy and they're not able to charge. So you have to be properly hydrated for that charge, and that the recharge at night will occur easier when people are hydrated. But an interesting part about water is that the body creates virgin water inside through the metabolism of animal fats. So in other words, if you consume, a high-fat diet and not a lot of water, you're still okay, because the body creates the virgin water that's needed. So water is kind of like the equalizing agent in the body that moderates all the processes. Leo always said it was the universal solvent.
Mm.
And coming back to the idea that elements are transmuted, I remember listening to this one researcher. So they analyzed a chicken and a chicken's egg. And they did a test, of how much calcium is in the chicken and how much is in the egg. And there's no way that a chicken can take the calcium from its own body and create that egg. Mm-hmm. But the chicken eats sand. Mm-hmm. So silica is actually the raw material for the calcium. Right. So the chicken has found the way to, make silica into calcium. So it's interesting that it occurs in the natural world all the time.
Transmutation.
Can I just add one thing to that? That's what Margaret just described with the calcium in the eggshell. that's actually the work of Louis Kervran in his book Biological Transmutation. And that not only do chickens do this, but he found that lobsters do this. They actually transmute the ocean minerals in the salt water into the outer crustacean shell. And so living beings actually transmute elements all the time, including us. Our liver does this for us. It's one of its jobs. So it's cool stuff.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation, and I've learned so much today. And with my experience with the Russell Sciences and listening to people that have come from a formal scientific background and how it's changed your perception of the world around you, and being involved with the cosmology conversation and cosmic messenger, I witnessed scientists stumbling into the conversation and how that begins to cross those links. Now, Scott, I know you were talking about referring yourself and back into the old science that you had originally learned and beginning to cross those links. As I'm beginning to see that, are you guys seeing that that's going to be kind of the next wave of the link over now that we're beginning to open up this conversation into a broader spectrum, whether it's the social media or the Zoom conversations? Once these scientists begin to find these missing links, how is this going to impact the message, the way that you guys begin to communicate this, and the future of Russellian science in the field around us? Because I do realize when I'm watching a astrophysicist or a microbiologist begin to understand light wave mechanics and apply it to their mind, that spark is so amazing. And I think that I'm just happy that you guys have the knowledge and the know-how to be able to assist this linking process.
I want to comment on that. I'm really ambivalent about, like, on one hand, the Russell science, it's very deep. It takes a long time to learn it. And so, it's got to be someone who wants to learn it, okay, on one hand. On the other hand, so that was me. I wanted to learn it. But now that I know it, I feel like I want to share it, with the world. But not everyone is going to be open to receiving it. Not everyone is going to want to even know about something. A lot of traditional scientists, like Darren said, will see this as, not real science. And so it's kind of a fine line. I've engaged with some people, and I get a whole mix of responses, from that's ridiculous, that's not real science, to, oh my gosh, this is amazing, why have I not heard of this before? So my answer to that is that I want to create content, and then that way people can interact with it when they're ready. But at least it'll be, if it's on the internet, then we'll have a much wider reach, so that the people all around the world who want to interact with it can. I do also a little bit want to kind of put myself out there to say, hey, you should come look at this, but I'm always just aware that, I think you guys might know better than me, but there was something about the Russells saying, hey, we're not going to go and rent a billboard to advertise, kind of hey, come learn this. What do you guys think about that?
Well, Walter said you can't go out to the highways and byways and compel men to think differently, men and women,
Right.
mankind. And in my experience, people are drawn to Walter's work, and they're very passionate about it. And those are the people with the open mind that you can really get somewhere with them. If you try to talk to a very traditional person who's kind of, I'll just say, indoctrinated, or they have a dogma, a system of belief, right, that they've really bought into because they paid for their school.
Right.
They put the work in, they put the time in to learn it, and they don't want to be told, that all of that's wrong and you have to start from scratch and relearn everything, which is what Walter was
Right.
telling you to do, is just throw everything out and start from scratch, So in my experience, you get people like, I won't give example, but there's people who are scientists and then they see pieces or aspects of Walter's work that they really find interesting, but they're not, bought into it enough to accept everything he said. So they'll just take pieces of it, and then you'll see it kind of trickle into their work. And they'll say, oh, I originated this or whatever, but they just don't want to give the credit to where it came from. And so in my experience, you're far better off just talking with somebody who's really interested in it rather than trying to convince the scientists. But at the same time, like Scott said, because we know it, we want to go tell them, like, hey, you don't have to waste 50 to 100 years on nothing science to not get an answer. You can actually get answers right now, and we've had them in our books since 1926, So we want to tell them, and we want to show them, but I also know that, there's going to be opposition to changing their mind and changing their thinking. So it has to be a gradual process, and the people who come to you that want to know, you give them your time instead of trying to just shove it down their throat when they're not willing to even entertain it.
Right.
Margaret,
Right.
I know you're going to answer, or you can simply buy multiple copies of the tiny little book called The Man Who Tapped the Secrets of the Universe and put them in everybody's stocking and give them for every gift from this point on, perhaps.
Actually, that's the book that got me started. I was a teenager in Canada. My physics teacher gave it to me. And he said, I'm teaching you about static electricity today, but in a few years, we'll be teaching you something entirely different. And he gave me that little book after class. And I would say, schooling today is more, as Darren says, indoctrination. It's conditioning. So unfortunately, schooling is conditioning. If you really want young people to open up, Darren was given the opportunity to choose his own subject at one point. Now, young children, if they, every parent knows this, a child will express an interest in a certain thing very young. And if a parent would encourage that, and just build on it and let the child determine their interests, because when they're born, they're coming through with a tremendous knowledge. And a parent that's really sensitive will see what a child is interested in. And there's a book by Ivan Illich. It's called Deschooling Society. And really, that's the answer. Like, I would love to see the Russell Science maybe in the homeschooling system, because it's less conditioned. There's a little bit more personal interaction and choice within that system. But ultimately, if we were to de-school society, it would be to a great benefit. And with the internet, you can choose a lot of your own research. Of course, a lot of it is censored, unfortunately. There's so much more that if it had not been censored out, we'd be farther along.
Thank you, Margaret. We have one more question back here, and then we're coming to our folks in Zoom.
Where does DeGraff Tyson, don't need it, where does DeGraff Tyson fall in some of this? He seems to be open to all sorts of different things publicly, but does he have the capacity, or does he embrace any of these positions that now, or is he going to take advantage of them and then make them his? I mean, he's the guy, if you could get him in the envelope, he has such great exposure that it would be a platform that would be unparalleled. So if you've got any thoughts on, either him or people of his ilk that could actually be messengers if we could tap into them.
You know, yeah, I'll comment on that. I mean, you know, I do think that he is a true scientist. I think he has come up with in the traditional, you know, indoctrination. So he's definitely invested in that traditional science. I don't know if he's had any exposure to Walter's stuff at all. You know, I do follow several different traditional scientists, and I can tell the ones that are more indoctrinated versus the ones who are more open-minded and who might be actually open to receiving something new if there's some merit behind it. And so, you know, at least for me, those are going to be the people that I kind of reach out to. There's a woman named Sabina. I don't know how to pronounce her last name, but she's a physicist on YouTube, and she's in that traditional like academia, but even she actually recently made a video kind of exposing traditional academia and how many of the things that get money are BS. They're just, it's stuff that's just not, you know, going to do anything for science, but they know it will get funding. And so that's kind of it's like the hamster wheel of people in academia. They have to just keep making papers to bring money into, you know, whatever college, you know, they're working for, or university they're working for. And, you know, and just bringing in money is very different than doing science that's actually going to make progress in science. So there's many people in academia who, although, you know, they have a PhD in physics, they're not doing anything to make progress in physics. And so, you know, and I don't know Neil deGrasse Tyson. I have no, you know, connection to him. But like, in my opinion, he seems to be someone who is open-minded if there was merit behind it. So I think like what Darren did today with, you know, the experiment, like showing, you know, it's one thing for us to get up here and talk about this, but showing that experiment, and now it's recorded, you know, that's at least a point where we can say, hey, look, you know, this really works here. It's repeatable, you know, and you can do it for yourself. If you think I rigged this thing up here or whatever, go to Home Depot, you know, put it together for yourself. You'll see it'll work just the same for you as it did for me. So I just think that things like that will be a good point to jump off to say, hey, you know, hey, this has merit, you know, would you be open to talking about this? You know, so, but once again, I don't have any connection with him, so, you know, that's gonna be in the future when we start if and when we start reaching out to people like that, we'll see what they say.
6 degrees.
Right?
The only thing I can say is Matt Presti showed me a TikTok or video clip, something of Neil deGrasse Tyson commenting on COVID. And what he said, which was kind of shocking, and the reason Matt showed it to me, is he said, basically, I'm paraphrasing, but he said, science is a consensus, you know. We all get together and we determine that's the speed of light, or we all get together and we determine, you know, that's when we shut a country down because of a virus. We all get together and we say, you know, it's this. And he said the individual scientist means nothing. And when he said that, I realized, you know, okay, well, he's not really a true scientist because the entire history of science is composed of individual scientists making individual breakthroughs. Michael Faraday found the law of induction, but guess what? Joseph Henry found it before him. But you know, Michael Faraday was the first to publish his results, so we call it Faraday's law of induction. But Henry is given the unit of inductance because he found it probably likely before Faraday did. So it's sort of a popularity contest in science, and it's first to publish, and that's who gets the credit and all that. So I think it's always been about the individual scientist, and it needs to continue to be that. Otherwise, you're not really doing good science when we just all get together and we say, I think that's the speed of light, and then everybody just goes, well, yeah, that sounds good to me, you know. And you're sort of giving up your right to an individual, independent thinking. And those are the people who've progressed science more than anybody else, are the individual thinkers.
Yeah, but I think
Sorry,
there's
we
a problem there. If someone has an individual, thinking and they want to make progress, but then if that thinking is opposed to kind of the general consensus of academia, then as soon as they come out with that, maybe they even have an experiment, they could be, shunned and, put on the blacklist. Like, no, this. Don't listen to his stuff. It goes against what everyone else is saying. There's a danger of that, I think.
There is much more we can say about that because our systems are woefully broken. That's actually part of why I'm here at the university, is because of my front row seat to watching the systems being broken. I'll share that a little bit more at the end.
Yeah.
But I do want to be mindful of our Zoom folks. Margaret, you want to add something before I go to the next question?
Yeah, just one quick comment. I know scientists that have worked at the Naval Research Lab, and I tell you one thing, they love complexity. The Russell science is so simple. They're almost ashamed, I think, or they just love and thrive on complexity. I know scientists that have been to CERN, the huge thing that, throws neutrinos, everywhere.
LHC.
I mean, they thrive on all this complexity. They want to try and figure out a mathematical formula, an ultimate formula. But the Russell science really ultimately is very simple. It's the stillness and then the two poles and the interaction and the conditioning. And so much can be explained with that. So I'd love to see us start anew with the children, maybe through homeschooling.
Very well said, Margaret. We have another question from our Zoom folks.
Question. With the 11-year cycle of sun activity reaching its peak, we are seeing increasing auroras as far south as the equator. Is this because of the greater potential of the sun's CMEs being attracted to the greater potential core of our planet, like and like? And is this normal cyclic phenomena, is it harmful to humans because our radiating less potential field around the planet is supposed to protect us? Is the Earth's EM changing, and is this measurable?
So what we call the aurora is really an atmospheric plasma from the light hitting our atmosphere. So basically the light leaves the sun and it expands, and it hits a point in between the sun and the earth where it's no longer expanding. It's expanded as much as it can, and it starts to actually contract. And we don't see this light. It's invisible until it's actually contracted, as Scott was saying, through the atmosphere. So think of our atmosphere works very much like a lens. It focuses and compresses the sunlight, and actually the sunlight's not hot when it's traveling in space. It's really mind bender to think about, but the light from the sun, which is really hot when it leaves the sun, is actually entirely cold as it's in between the sun and the earth. So this impaction into the contraction of the atmosphere is what creates that coronal plasma that we see as the aurora borealis. And it will travel because the earth is constantly moving and constantly changing and fluxing to stay in balance with the sun. And this isn't really damaging to people because you're built extremely well and your electrical system is very, very finely tuned to work well with the earth. And basically, if you have it's only going to affect what we call our electrical grid system. So the man-made electrical system, for instance, in 1921, there was this massive coronal discharge that hit the Earth, and it completely knocked out our telegraph and the electrical distribution. So the only effect on us is that it could have is on our technology, but it won't. I don't believe it has the ability to like interfere with the human's bioelectrical field. But there's still a lot that we don't understand within that. There's a good book called The Body Electric, and that's just a crack at trying to understand what this aurora around the human body, or the auric field, consists of, because we're each kind of a little generator, and we produce radiation pattern around the body as well, which could be considered like a corona around the human. So yeah, it should be safe, and the Earth is kind of like the perfect habitat for us to interchange with that environment. So we should be fine, I hope.
And I would just add that the Russells say that everything in the universe pulses. So the Earth has a pulse. Tesla knew the frequency of the Earth's pulse. In other words, Tesla, through his resonant theory, he said he could crack open the Earth, through resonance. But the sun would also pulse. And I don't know the duration of the sun's pulse, but it's a natural phenomena for everything to actually breathe or pulse.
Thank you, Margaret. Okay, another Zoom question. The Russell chart of the elements displays the energy moving from one octave to another. I find that puzzling. Can you help explain that? And one more question to follow up with that. Everything has 4 stages: baby, child, teen, and adult, starting at compress and expanding. How can we understand this cycle in an octave?
So I'll try to answer the first part. The octaves, Walter always said that you needed to, rather than, your first instinct is to look at the top and then work your way to the bottom, because that's just kind of how we look at stuff. But the octaves really begin with the inert gases. So he always answered that question of like, well, where does the octave begin? It begins on that midline, which is like a 2-dimensional plane. Margaret was saying the inert gases are the bridge between God and man, and that is in a sense where the octave begins, because it's a flat 2-dimensional plane, and we really project, like Scott was saying, we start horizontal, we start projecting vertically, and the vertical is actually horizontal, so the octave kind of goes that way almost, where now it's vertical, right, and it started horizontal. So the octave is really a projection from the inert gas outward into the wave field, which is sort of the space confined within the cube. So it does progress, and the reason it progresses is because the inert gases are enfolded one within the other. And Walter said an analogy for this is like rings on a phonograph or an LP record. Or even a CD disc, because a CD optical disc also has rings, or you read it with a laser in rings. So they're all enfolded within one another, and they progress by pressure of light. So as we increase the pressure of light, we get further and further into higher octaves. So that is pretty much how they progress. You want to add anything to that?
Right. I mean, we can almost, I see like each octave as like its own cubic wave field. Like it's got its cathode plane, or which would be the inert gas. And he describes how from that inert gas, I think it's in Atomic Suicide, that there are rings that will expand out towards the corners of the cube, and so it'll start and it will expand. The gravitative spiral will contract that light to the corner, which would be, up to the 90 degrees, and that's called the
Amplitude.
the amplitude. Thank you. The amplitude of the wave, but he describes how the wave, his waves are not the same as like a rope. If you had a rope on the ground and you kind of did it up and down, and you would see this traveling wave. It's different in his concept. It's actually the wave starts in the middle, goes out, and comes back. So you have this pulsing just in that one octave. So now it always has been, and this is something I'm still learning and studying, in terms of like when the inert gases, as Darren explained, are like within each other, so it's kind of like, would you say it's like they're all pulsing kind of almost on top of each other, and it's just like, different octaves are just have different dimensions, in terms of like the frequency that it's pulsing? That's what I'm not sure about. I mean, I can understand. Walter always showed just like one cubic wave field, usually just one. And he's like, if you just get this, then you can extend that to, for everywhere. I'd never really found a good explanation, kind of the connection, kind of from wave field to wave field. Other than his notebook, I guess that's the best. But I don't know if you wanted to comment on that.
There's a real interesting passage in Why You Cannot Die by Leo Russell, where she was describing one of Walter Russell's experiments where he took a very thin filament of tungsten and it was wrapped around a silk thread. Well, he passed a huge amperage current through it and it just evaporated the tungsten. This was within a vacuum tube. And he did an analysis of the contents of that tube, and it was no longer tungsten, but it was helium.
Helium.
So in other words, the tungsten actually stepped all the
Dropped.
way back to helium, which is really the space octave that we live in.
Right.
So it skipped all those octaves.
Yeah.
So it's almost
And
like
straight to
releasing pressure out of a balloon, right? It goes back to its original shape, and so the residual inert gas was helium. And you go, well, shouldn't it have been xenon, right?
Right.
For
It
It have
tungsten.
like stepped down.
But see, he did this experiment in this localized pressure
Right.
zone. And if you look where carbon, right? Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, the stuff that we experience on a daily basis as an interface, that's all within the fourth octave. So that tungsten, once liberated or killed, right, it actually dropped back to the fourth octave pressure. Just like releasing pressure out of a container, it equalizes with the environment. And the same exact thing happened in that experiment.
And Leah Russell, she goes further in the book to say that there's actually an easy way to create xenon, which is used in those huge lights over baseball fields. So if you use this principle, you can bring tungsten to xenon, and perhaps simply by electrocuting the tungsten under greater pressure. So it'll stop at xenon.
Yeah.
And then you can, and because I think the processes today, it's very expensive in
It is.
creating it.
Even, I can speak from experience, even to purchase a tank of helium. We used to use helium in our GCMSs, which is gas chromatography. We used it in our lab to analyze drugs, various drugs in urine. And we used a helium carrier to pump helium through our GCMS machine. And these were extremely expensive tanks of helium because it's so costly to produce and manufacture. So even if we used Russell Science just to manufacture inert gases or even rare earth elements, that would be a huge boon to industry.
I want to open it up for any other additional questions here before we go to any other chat questions. Yes. And if you all could raise your hand and let me know, and give me a heads up if you have a question, I'll plan to come your way.
So I'm doing some research right now where I'm building my own optical dynamo generator, or trying to. And one of the questions I had was, Russell talks about, when talking about compression and expansion, that length always contracts in the inverse square ratio during compression, and the volumetric contraction occurs in an inverse cube ratio. But when going through like all the, on the shirt right there, yeah, that's the chart. And then in the Secret of the Wave book, he talks about the contractions occurring in golden ratio proportion. And then when going through some of the archive material, it looks like Russell designed his stuff to contract in golden ratio proportion too, which seems to me like it doesn't quite, I'm just trying to reify these two things and make sense of what he was doing there as it relates to what he was saying with what's on the shirt there.
Yeah, I always heard him talk about universal ratios. Yeah, this is why I love this shirt. And in the Universal One, there's chapters on the universal ratios. Now, I actually haven't heard anywhere where Walter talks about the golden ratios, but maybe you guys have, because.
Well, mathematically, you can lift it. You can extrapolate it from the. I did this too. I took the schematic and I measured it, and then I extracted what the various angles were and everything like that. He did quite a number of experiments in the 60s with actually, fabricating the coils and measuring the magnification or the multiplication, he said, from the contraction. And I think what it was is he knew the principle fully, but he said in the documents and the letters, correspondence and everything, that the translation to a physical dynamo generator required experimentation, because in some senses you could have the multiplication too high and then you would essentially melt down the core and the coil itself. So he almost had to change the angle of multiplication so that it only produced, say, 8,000 times what you started with rather than 64,000. And so he did talk about these ratios of stepping up, like how the melting point of carbon is 3,600 degrees centigrade, right, versus some of the other lesser dense elements. So he kind of detuned almost the multiplication factor in the dynamo so that it was producing more than you put in, but it wasn't, running away on you and producing uncontrollable heat, because he could, by this method of contraction, you can just melt it straight down. And he actually talked about one time he powered the coil, but he didn't have a nut on the end of it to secure the coil. And what happened was it flashed and it spread apart. The coil split in parts and was found at the locked potential position of each half of the octave.
Oh, wow.
And so if you don't bolt the coil together, it'll find that nodal point. That Tesla also talked about, these nodal points in the sine waves where there's reversals. And this same thing happens in the coil too. So there's a little bit of experimentation, but if you enjoy it, it's a great learning process to translate something that's a concept into the actual, functioning device. But you want something that you can control, that you can extract useful energy from.
Oh, in that case, he actually had to make it a little less efficient, maybe, in order to
Well,
not let it run away.
because if you apply the full multiplication, right, it's basically 8 times 8, right? If a man and a woman work together, you have 8 times the power as a single versus a single individual. So that's why, and we are designed to work like that in pairs of male and female, because Leo Russell was actually instrumental in the production of the optical dynamo. She saved Walter's butt a few times because he had it wired up wrong and he was about to turn it on and melt down, and she goes, check that again, So she was, absolutely part and parcel to the success of that device.
She did say to me one time that Walter Russell almost blew up the place. So,
Okay, this is a really quick question with hopefully some quick answers, and then one more complicated question. So the quick one, have you identified any other Russell experiments you would like to try? I believe this was directed at Darren.
Yes. My biggest interest by far was Walter Russell's transmutation experiments at the Westinghouse Laboratory in 1927. In fact, one of the biggest reasons I traveled to Virginia originally was to look through the archives, because Matt Presti opened it up for anybody in the science committee. If you wanted to look through the archives, you could. And I had seen a presentation by Nassim Haramein in Barcelona. And in that, at the very end, he actually shows a picture on the screen of a schematic diagram of the transmutor device that Walter used. And so I go, oh my God, that document exists still. So I knew if I could go to the archives in Virginia, I could maybe try to track that down and find it. But I wanted the most amount of detail for how he did that experiment, because he was turning 5 cc's of liquid water into different gases and different ratios of gases. So for instance, he could take water, which is hydrogen and oxygen, and he could get nitrogen out of it. Now, nitrogen's not present in pure water. And then sometimes there'd be more oxygen. So he could oblate or prolate the actual atomic nucleus to get the different elements out in different ratios. So for me, that's an experiment that I've really wanted to replicate as closely as possible, because Dr. Tim Binder and Toby Groats tried to replicate it in the 90s, but they used solenoids going in an east-west direction that they angled, and that is not what Walter did. That was just their guess at the arrangement of the solenoids. So that experiment of transmutation is still yet to be done, and it's the one that I want to do the most. But it'll change the entire paradigm of chemistry if we can prove that again.
Darren, can you share a little bit with anybody who is not familiar about what that was in 1927, I believe, and then what Walter Russell was awarded as a result? Because we are talking about a man who did not have that kind of formal education.
So the experiment is talked about in this book. He describes essentially taking water and 4 solenoids, or 4 coils, similar to what I showed you, and by this arrangement he could alter. So essentially he heated up the water and made it a vapor. Then he stuck it in this device with a magnetic field, and as it cooled, he was changing the gyroscopic rotation of the atoms as they achieved equilibrium. And then he would test it, and they would come out different gases. So he's actually found an entirely new way of using magnetic power by changing the gyroscopic rotation and precession of atomic nuclei. And he said that was the key to transmuting elements at will. You start with gases. Once you've mastered that, you can go to liquids, and then finally you could do solids. But to start with the gases, that's really the beginning.
What was he awarded?
Well, basically the short version is he was approached by Westinghouse Laboratories because they were having problems figuring out how to plate chromium. And he basically solved that problem using his charts, right, and his knowledge of the wave. He solved that problem for them, and then they said, well, you want money? What do you want? And he goes, no, I just want to use your laboratory. So he used the laboratory, and he did these experiments in 27, and then went around and he lectured in the right before 1930 to all of these laboratories, Union Carbide, Westinghouse, all the big ones. And then basically in 1930, a guy got the Nobel Prize for the discovery of heavy water, which is deuterium. But Walter Russell told them, hey, go poke around in the hydrogen octave up here. Go poke around in the hydrogen octave and you'll find other elements. Now, they called them isotopes, but there are no isotopes in nature until you get to the 6th octave. So deuterium and tritium are not isotopes. They are actually full-tone elements in the hydrogen space octave. And that discovery, even though Urey got the Nobel Prize in 1930, we still to this day don't give any credit to Walter Russell for the actual identification of elements that were later discovered in the laboratory.
Yeah.
Thank you.
The only thing I would add to when Darren cited the gyroscopic principle, in the new concept book, Walter Russell said if you can convert nitrogen to hydrogen, he said it's only at 90-degree angle. The two elements are at 90 degrees to one another. So if you can take nitrogen, shift it 90 degrees, you'll produce hydrogen. So he said that would be key in using hydrogen as a world fuel. And I always thought, well, wouldn't it be great, copper and gold are very similar metals. They have similar qualities. And wouldn't it be nice if we could put copper under some kind of pressure and create gold, So that was my only thought. What's that?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment really quick. Walter told them, the periodic table, started at hydrogen, and, so he pointed out, hey, there's stuff before hydrogen, but he also did that on the other side. He's like, you look above uranium, you'll find something there too. And sure enough, then, we have
Neptunium and plutonium.
Yep. And so, once again, he's pointing things out, but he didn't actually get the credit in the end, so.
Yeah, and I did find letters of he had written letters of protest to the Nobel Foundation, but he never sent those letters. And I believe it was Leo who said, darling, don't send these. She knew he would get his credit eventually, but he was pretty sour grapes that other people got awards. He didn't want the prize money. What he wanted was the accolade that comes with a Nobel Prize award. People in the scientific community will listen to what you have to say.
Right.
Yeah, that's what he wanted.
But I think Walter Russell was also instructed during his illumination when some of the material should be released. And I don't think he followed that instruction to the letter. I think it would have been better had he not pointed them to the direction of uranium and plutonium. It would have been better if he had waited,
Right.
All right. All right, last question from Zoom. Please clarify the relationship of the cube-sphere-spiral connection throughout all of nature and throughout the universe.
Okay,
Wow.
well,
Okay.
the easiest way is you get yourself a mirror cube and you look inside it, because you can see infinity in a box. But the short answer is, in a cube, the distance from the center of the cube to the walls of the cube is actually a shorter distance than from the center of the cube to the corner of the cube. And it's this difference in the length from the center to the side or the center to the corner, that is the reason that everything curves and spirals toward the corner of the cube. Okay? So that's the relationship between spiral and the cube. Now the sphere is also contained within the cube, but what happens is as it hits the boundary, now Walter says that nature doesn't allow there to be the emptiness in the corners. So as the wave sphere expands out, it touches the sides of the cube, and then it keeps expanding flat on that surface outward like that, and that's what creates compression toward the corner further. So you never actually waste any of the space in the cube, and the cube is full of spherical intersections, and they overlap like Vesica Pisces, right? And the minute two spheres overlap, you create a biconvex lens which focuses light back to the point of its origin. So that's why compression and expansion, you can never create one without the other. They're always part and parcel or present simultaneously with the other half of it. So that's the relation between the cube, the spiral, and the sphere.
And it goes throughout the universe because, in one wave field, when an action like that happens, then, Walter says it actually happens throughout the whole universe because that action is reflected in each adjacent cubic wave field, in all directions. So it's just the connectivity of the entire universe. When something happens in one place, it happens everywhere in the whole universe at the same time, which is kind of mind-blowing, but that's what he said the connection is.
He also said if you wiggle your little finger, that the heavens all move to keep it in balance. So think about that the next time you're moving your body.
Right. That's how connected it is.
Yeah.
Right.
Any other questions from the audience as we're wrapping up here? You have one more? Only if... Sure, nobody else has a question here. Richard's going for a big one. We know his questions. All right.
Go for it.
First, a comment to the gentleman in the back that asked about scientists giving some corroboration to the Russell science. And there is a noted scientist, mathematician out there named Robert Edward Grant, who, if you haven't looked at some of his work, does give credence to the work of Walter Russell. And if you go to philosophy.org, the video tab for 2022 Homecoming actually has his talk on the intersection of art, science, and spirituality. So there is some credence, and I'm going to say at least the quasi-scientific community. He's an outstanding mathematician. He holds a lot of patents. He's done a lot of research. And then the question I kind of wanted to go back to, I guess I'm still just really interested in the interface between the two universes that we live in and how they function seamlessly as one, and where that merger point is. And so my question kind of goes back to water. If water holds consciousness, I'm wondering to what extent, if at all, that this water that we hold in our body is actually liquid light. The Russells teach us that man is light and God is love. And so I'm just wondering if our consciousness somehow lives in the water in the cells of our body. What do you think about that?
I mean, I would say that the way Walter describes how, God is in the center of everything, and he's also on the outside of everything. That concept of the still light being God, and there's no motion there, so it's there's no beginning and no end. It's endless, with no dimension, but it's everywhere. And then you have the universe of the physical motion, where things are polarized and moving. They're moving around, but, that stillness is at the fulcrum. But it's also on the, wherever that action is happening, there's the sides of the cube that are no curvature, like not moving, so that's like, the outside controlling, and then there's the center point controlling. I just think it's really interesting. That's how, in my opinion, or my understanding of it, that's how an action can happen in one place and it be happening in every place, because that stillness is in the center of every cubic wave field that's out there, of every moving piece of matter. There's that still point of God, there, everywhere. So that's in my interpretation of it is that's how everything can be connected, instantaneously, because there's this still point that is infinite with no dimension. Anyway, that's my comment on it there.
I would say there's a lady in New Zealand, her name is Veda Austin. She's done a lot about research on water. And it seems like too unbelievable, really, but what she does is she'll take a little petri dish, she'll put in a centimeter or two of water, and she'll use varying types of water, and then she'll imprint a thought onto the water, and then she'll put it in a deep freeze, and she waits like 10, 15 minutes, and then she looks at the crystal that was formed. And it's quite interesting because one time she did one, and her little girl was doing London bridges falling down, you know, and so the water was imprinted with falling down, and she pulls it out of the freezer and she sees an image of London Bridge. And then there was another one where she simply said marriage, and then she pulls it out after it has time to freeze, and the crystal shows an image of a wedding ring. So it's a little bit, you know, you think, oh, this has got to be hokey, but she's done it and she's teaching other people how to do it. It's been repeated so many times, but it's interesting to research because it shows some type of memory. And I'm guessing, you know, water, hydrogen and oxygen is close to helium. Helium is an inert gas, which means helium cannot interact with any other element. Okay, helium is zero. So maybe because water is so close to helium, and helium holds the memory or the record, and so is that why water is responding to her commands or her conversation? I don't know. So
There's an experiment that I'm aware of that I won't name him, but there's an individual who took a cap full of water, a plastic cap, and he applied what looked like normal positive negative battery current to it for about three or 4 seconds. The cap was dumped on the ground and he lit a match and the water would burn. So there's proof that you can put the memory of fire, because the guy was thinking about fire as he was applying the power to the water. So he pushed a thought through his head through his hands into the electricity and then into the water. And then the water would burn when he applied a match to it. But the interesting thing is, and to try to maybe answer your question, is if there was somebody standing and watching this who thought this was all BS, the water would not burn. You just put it in the puddle and and the match would go out. But as soon as that guy who was a doubting Thomas stepped out of the shed, then the experiment was repeated, the water would catch fire and burn away. And it wasn't a consuming flame. You could wipe your hand through it and it was just water. Mm-hmm. So you can put memory into water, but it's what you believe, whether or not it will actually carry that out or not. And this is probably how we work too, because we send a little thought down and we wiggle our finger, but it's going through all that electricity is all going through water.
All right, we have come to the end of our lovely day, so I'm going to give you 60 seconds each. What are final words that you want to say for posterity from today?
God is light, God is love, and the fact that you exist means you are loved deeply because you exist.
And I would say it's really a gift to be able to manifest. So while you're in a body, you know, you can manifest. Because Walter Russell always said, you know, a thought is one thing, but to give it form so that it can be reinterpreted by others is really the magic. So if you read the home study course and the books, Leah Russell, in her book, God Will Work With You But Not For You, in the 1950s, she obliterated the germ theory in medicine, and she explains why. So, like, you want to, since you can reinterpret what's been given to us by the curriculum of this university, it's a wealth. And my God, it's like people would have a much greater understanding of the reason for being here. And they would probably find their passion and know what to do in their life. They wouldn't be lost. So I would say reinterpret the messages of light in this curriculum.
It's like a treasure chest hidden right here in the middle of Virginia.
Right.
Yeah, I think that, at least when I first engaged with Walter's philosophy, it seemed so incredible to me that it was like unbelievable. And, then as I engaged with his science, which also seemed kind of unbelievable, but, the more I learned about it and I realized, wait a minute, this is real science, and then seeing the proof of the experiments being done in front of my face multiple times, working every time, then that was like the proof for me. Like, it's like now I have scientific proof of his philosophy, and it's like, this is like literally proof of God here and his philosophy. And so then I was like, wow, well then that means, I have a physical body that might grow and die, but I have a body that's non-physical that will not die, that is part of God, and because of that, we have this amazing power to create in this world. And, just realizing that, and we all have it. We just have to tap into it. Like Russell described how we can all be geniuses, we just tap into it and, work with God. And so I just think it's just a huge gift that the Russells have given to this world in their writings and their teachings. And so I just encourage everyone to, read their message, and as you do read it and practice it, you will see things happen for you that are incredible. So
Please join me in thanking. Wait, before you go, I'm getting a signal that we might have had a last-minute breaking news in the back.
Okay. Actually, if you go to drtomcowan.com, he has 3 books. And the one that's really critical about water, he references cancer in the title. He said that the MRI actually shows water that has lost its structure, and that's why it shows a cancer tumor. So in other words, if you can keep the water structured in the body, you can dissipate cancer. And so Dr. Tom Cowan, COWAN.com. And so he has 3 books, but the one that references water in the title. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Any other signal from the back? Okay.